Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed. But the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe, and share. The year of our case. The year was 1857. In Pulaski County, Arkansas, a place swollen with cotton wealth and the cruelty that sustained it. The Ruttold family, long established along the Arkansas River, commanded fields and bodies alike. Their patriarch, Colonel Jeremiah Ruttold, styled himself a gentleman planter, though those who whispered in the quarters called him a despot. The Thanksgiving of that year is remembered not for feasts or sermons, but for an act so violent, so incomprehensible, that it shattered the illusions of mastery. On that night, one enslaved man, known only as Samson, placed his hands upon his owner's neck, and with impossible force, snapped it clean through. Fragments from the archive, the details do not survive in a single account. They bleed across parish registers, Pinkerton files, and the desperate correspondence of a physician, Dr. Marcus Kleinman, whose hand trembled across folios now housed in restricted collections. Pulaski County Register, November 1857. Jeremiah Ruttold, deceased suddenly, Thanksgiving night. Cause, misadventure. Witnesses unavailable. Private letter, M. Kleinman to Professor Voss, Philadelphia, 2 December 1857. I fear what we have cultivated has ripened too soon. The specimen displays strength fourfold of ordinary men, and a will not subject to restraint. These records, redacted, bear stamps of confiscation, property of War Department, do not reproduce. Samson, the subject. Who was Samson? Born in obscurity, purchased in New Orleans, sold upriver, and finally placed under Colonel Ruttold's dominion. Samson was no ordinary laborer. Descriptions from those who saw him at the plantation gates speak of a frame towering above 6.5 feet, with shoulders like carved oak beams, and hands that swallowed the haft of any tool given him. But more alarming were his eyes. A deacon's wife, writing in her diary, noted, "The giant's gaze is unsettling, as though he perceives one's thoughts before they are spoken." Later testimony from Dr. Kleinman suggests these were no accidents of birth. Samson, like others, had been subjected to experimental regimens, tinctures, surgical manipulations, enforced therapeutics under the guise of plantation medicine. His very body had become a ledger of violation. Thanksgiving night, the Ruttold plantation house was filled with guests, among them Judge Dillingham and Dr. Petton, both accustomed to the colonel's brand of brutal hospitality. Slaves were ordered to perform, to cook, to serve. What happened next is preserved in hushed accounts, none complete. Sheriff Brage, who arrived hours later, would only state, "The master was found upon the floor of his dining room, his neck sundered as if by an iron press." None present could account for the speed or silence of the deed. Others whispered that Samson stood unmoving after the act, his breath steady, his eyes fixed on the stunned assembly, until he simply turned and walked into the night. Signs left behind, the physical remnants of that evening became objects of rumor. The carriage house, where Samson paused before fleeing, still bore his handprints pressed deep into oak beams, indentations no man should have been capable of leaving. Years later, visitors to the abandoned Ruttold estate reported those impressions remained, weathered yet unmistakable. An anonymous Pinkerton memorandum, 1858, reads, "The imprints are not to be exhibited to locals. They incite unrest and confirm dangerous speculation about the subject's condition." The shadow of Kleinman. At the center of these strange disclosures stood Marcus Kleinman, physician of German extraction, who had served the Ruttolds under contract. His surviving letters, though many are charred or redacted, reveal his complicity in the so-called enhancement program. He referred to Samson as Subject 14 and catalogued his musculature, reflexes, cranial measurements, with the clinical detachment of a man blind to humanity. Yet in later pages, fear overtakes science. What was intended as control has become contagious. The mind asserts itself. The will cannot be constrained. He will not submit, nor can he be broken by instrument or ether. Kleinman's panic is not that of a man who failed an experiment, but of one who realized his experiment had succeeded too well. The whispers spread. Word of the event traveled swiftly, though distorted by rumor. In Little Rock Tavern spoke of a slave who could lift an ox cart. In Camden, Whispers called him the bone breaker of Little Rock. Among the enslaved, the tale carried another tone, not horror but a strange kind of hope, that one of their number had not only resisted, but had become something more than his oppressors imagined possible. The first cover-up, Colonel Ruttle's death, was entered officially as misadventure. No trial was ever recorded, no wanted posters ever issued in Pulaski County, yet files, stamped with Pinkerton seals, reveal a manhunt extending into Missouri and Tennessee, though always described in euphemism, locating escaped subject property, dangerous condition. Already, forces larger than local law were moving. Samson's act had drawn the attention of national agents, whose interest in him was not punishment, but recovery of data, of specimen, of secrets that must not reach public ear. Thus begins the Samson crisis, a story born of blood on Thanksgiving night, of a body engineered and a will unshackled. The plantation walls could not contain what had been cultivated there, and the shadows stretching from Pulaski County would soon fall across the entire nation. The murder at the Ruttled plantation should have ended in a spectacle of punishment. By custom, a slave who had killed his master was meant to be hunted, torn from hiding, and displayed as an example to all. Yet what followed was not the neat closure of an execution, but the opening of something vast, festering, and uncontainable. The night Colonel Ruttle's neck was snapped became the beginning of a fracture in the old order. Word spread, not in the loud proclamations of newspapers, but in whispers carried by travelers, in guarded conversations between merchants, and in the hymns sung after dusk in slave quarters. From Little Rock to Helena, from Camden to the trading posts on the Mississippi, the same stories surfaced. Men and women not merely escaping bondage, but resisting with a strength that seemed to surpass natural limits. And always the same name surfaced, a name spoken with awe and dread in equal measure: Samson. The Pinkerton Files. It was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, still new to its work, that first collected the fragments into a single dossier. The file bore the title Case of the Freedom Chain, a phrase that would appear again and again in suppressed correspondence. The papers, brittle and ink-faded, reveal a steady escalation. Memorandum, number 7, January 8, alias Samson, has inspired a sequence of imitative uprisings. These disturbances appear not spontaneous, but coordinated, suggesting shared instruction or unseen correspondence. Memorandum number 9. Camden Incident. Escaped Negroes exhibited formidable resistance. Eyewitness claims one woman slight of build lifted a wagon shaft to strike down an armed militiaman. Report is disputed, but 3 witnesses corroborate. Memorandum number 12. Subject group demonstrates elevated endurance. Claims of wounds endured without incapacitation. One described as continuing despite musket injury to thorax. Each page bears a heavy black line through names and places, whole sentences blotted into illegibility. At the bottom of several pages appears a chilling stamp in red: for internal use only, disclosure punishable by imprisonment. The Pinkertons, though mercenaries, understood that what they pursued was not mere rebellion. Something engineered was unfolding before them. Kleinman's panic. Amid the murk of rumor, one voice cried out in unvarnished terror. Dr. Marcus Klein, once a medical consultant to Colonel Ruttle, Kleinman now found himself pulled before discreet inquiries in St. Louis, his reputation hollowed by association. Letters preserved in the Voss collection, Berlin 1861, revealed the depth of his panic. Letter to Prof. Voss, March 1858. They call it chain, but it is not of iron. It is inheritance, altered in marrow in sinew. What began with my tinctures and sores has slipped the leash. The trait leaps from one body to another beyond tincture, beyond knife. I have birthed contagion disguised as liberty. Here is a man who once boasted of measuring skulls with calipers and boiling tinctures in brass pots, suddenly begging to be absolved. His science had outpaced his control, and now his subjects multiplied without him. Camden, Arkansas. Camden was where the rumors hardened into fact. In April 1858, a group of enslaved people staged a carefully timed exodus, slipping from their quarters under cover of a river fog. They were pursued by militia and cornered at the Ouachita Bridge. The diary of Captain Elim Burroughs, a militia officer, was discovered among his descendants and later seized during Reconstruction. His handwriting trembles as it records, "We fired upon them as ordered. One was struck in chest, the wound plain as day, but he did not fall. He came on as if iron struck iron. My comrade was lifted, flung into river as one might toss a rag. I swear by my honor these were not men as we know men. The fugitives did not scatter, they fought as one, breaking the militia line and vanishing into the swamp. Whether Samson himself was among them remains uncertain. Witnesses swore they saw a giant figure at the head of the column, but even the Pinkertons admitted that his image had become so inflated by rumor that his presence might be no more than projection. Yet it mattered little whether Samson walked there or not. His name carried the terror. Panic in Tennessee. By summer of 1858, unrest had spread to western Tennessee. A raid on a plantation near Jackson left overseers dead. The fields set ablaze and the fugitives vanished into night. Survivors whispered of raiders who seemed to strike in perfect unison, who moved without hesitation or fear. The federal government, alarmed, dispatched troops not to punish but to collect specimens. A word that still chills the blood. Surviving orders from the War Department read, recover living bodies where possible for study and containment, dead subjects to be transported intact. This was not suppression of rebellion, this was containment of an experiment gone awry. The congressional undercurrent. Not all remained silent. Joshua R. Giddings of Ohio, abolitionist congressman, raised the matter obliquely in chamber. His remarks buried in the Congressional Globe, cut through with startling candor. If even a portion of these testimonies bear truth, then we face not the slaves' revolt but the deliberate mutilation of God's creation. To breed or alter men for profit is sin compounded with treason. What festers in Arkansas will not remain in Arkansas. His words were met with uproar. Southern representatives thundered that Giddings trafficked in abolitionist fantasy. The matter was tabled, his language quietly stricken from the official record. Yet marginalia in the Pinkerton files note, Monitor Giddings seeks exposure. Instruments and ledgers. The horror lay not only in rumor, but in the evidence recovered from the abandoned carriage house of the Ruttled estate. An inventory lists brass calipers, their hinges blackened with blood, ether mask, glass cracked, gauze stiff with old residue, bone sore, teeth worn smooth from overuse, ledger of tinctures, laudanum, vitriol powder, composition unknown, notes on forceps modified with copper screws, suggesting not birth but intervention in adult subjects. Each entry annotated, study, then destroy. One marginal note, likely Kleinman's, reads, subject retains fracture memory in both. The meaning remains obscure but its phrasing alone suggests the grotesque depths of his work. The murmurs in the quarters. Among enslaved communities the legend of Samson grew not in terror but in song. After dusk, hidden from overseers, voices rose in low harmony of the man who broke chains, of the giant who turned his master's hand against him, of the one who would not kneel, who showed them strength was possible. The hymns were warnings and promises both. Spreading faster than Pinkerton horses could ride, Samson had become more than a man. He was a myth, a chain linking those still bound to those already free. By the end of 1858, the term freedom chain was whispered in both drawing rooms and slave cabins. To the enslaved it meant hope, to their masters, it meant contagion, to the Pinkertons, it meant an assignment without end, and to Dr. Kleinman, sleepless, pen trembling, begging for mercy, it meant a horror of his own devising, multiplying beyond recall. From Little Rock to Camden, to the fields of Tennessee, one broken neck had widened into a national crisis, and in every account, real or rumored, the name Samson towered at the center. The year was 1859, and the crisis that began with one snapped neck in Little Rock had swollen into something far larger than any plantation uprising. Rumors of enhanced fugitives, men and women with strength 4 times that of ordinary soldiers, echoed from Mississippi to New York. The whispers had reached so high that they could no longer be ignored, and so, in the shadowed halls of Washington, a congressional inquiry was convened. Its members were not abolitionists or visionaries, but weary men forced by mounting evidence to look into matters best left buried. What unfolded over those months was nothing less than the unmasking of a secret chapter in American science, a chapter so grotesque that even seasoned politicians recoiled. The Kleinman testimony. At the center of it all was Dr. Marcus Kleinman, summoned under subpoena and placed under oath. His hands shook as he gripped the railing, spectacles sliding down his nose, sweat darkening the armpits of his frock coat. The stenographer's notes preserve every halting word. We did not begin with invention, he muttered, but with necessity. The planters demanded men who would not tire, women who would not fall ill, children who could endure the lash and rise again at dawn.
They asked for flesh as machine, and I sought to give it to them. He spoke of tinctures forced down unwilling throats, of marrow transfusions performed in candlelit barns, of crude surgeries where copper pins and brass clamps held bones in unnatural alignment. What had started as an attempt to improve enslaved labor soon outpaced its plantation origin. We discovered traits that could be bred, muscles that grew beyond proportion, reflexes sharpened, vision heightened, bones knit faster after breaking. The subject designated Samson. He was our pinnacle, 400% stronger than baseline human, intellect exceeding every expectation, leadership instincts, dangerous, uncontrollable. Gasps rustled through the chamber. Kleinman's words painted not the picture of a beast, but of a man improved to the point of mastery, and thus impossible to keep as property. Beyond the enslaved, what chilled the room was not Samson's description, but what followed. Kleinman confessed that by the mid-1850s, the experiment had outgrown its original scope, no longer confined to the enslaved. Subjects now included prisoners, immigrants, and eventually volunteer soldiers, men told they were contributing to science. Though the risks were never explained, the language in his testimony remains clinical, but the reality is horror. Their marrow was harvested and exchanged, their nerves tested under flame and blade, their children bore signs before they could walk. He admitted the project had metastasized into a federal affair, funded quietly, through the War Department since 1852, under the guise of agricultural improvement and special military research.
The military interest. Enter General Winfield Scott, silver-haired and imposing, called into closed session. Unlike Kleinman, Scott was unrepentant. Gentlemen, he declared, we saw potential where others saw abomination. A soldier who could march 10 days without rest, carry twice the weight of his fellows, tear down barricades with his bare hands, such a man would be worth 100 in the field. He admitted the military had conducted its own trials. Enhanced recruits showed promise in reconnaissance and combat. Yet there was a flaw. The same traits that gave them strength also unraveled discipline. They would not obey, Scott confessed. Orders were questioned, missions abandoned. Sympathy for enemy causes, even for the slave, was observed. We executed 2 for mutiny, the rest deserted, and with them vanished knowledge we cannot afford to lose. By 1857, the Army shuttered its program, but not before unleashing dozens of enhanced individuals into the countryside, men who vanished, some taking with them secrets of war. The unknown numbers. Congress reeled at the scale. Kleinman estimated that by the height of the program, scores, perhaps hundreds, had been altered. Many were dead, many had escaped, a few remained in captivity. Their locations were obscured under layers of false ledgers and burned correspondence. We lost count, Kleinman whispered. They are out there now, breeding, spreading, and I know not what their children may become. The phrase hung in the chamber, breeding, spreading, a generation not merely freed, but transformed into something new, walking among the unsuspecting. Samson's intervention. As if summoned by fate, the inquiry took a turn when a letter arrived, delivered by intermediaries, men whose names remain redacted to this day. It bore the signature not only of Samson, but of 50 other enhanced subjects. The letter was read into the record. I write to you not as property, not as fugitive, but as a free man. We were torn apart and remade, our flesh twisted for profit, our blood bartered as though it were seed. You claim liberty yet deal in bondage. You preach equality yet practice mutilation. We demand 3 things: the end of all experiments, the release of all captives, and recognition of our humanity. Deny us, and we shall secure it ourselves. The words cracked through the Capitol like thunder. This was not a runaway's plea, but a declaration of independence. Reactions in the chamber. Southern representatives roared with fury, demanding manhunts, bounties, executions. To them, Samson's words confirmed their worst fears. Slaves not just rebelling, but evolving into something superior. Northern voices hesitated. Some whispered sympathy. These men had been wronged, mutilated, exploited. Others whispered fear. What if Samson and his kin turned violent? Could they topple the very republic? For days the Capitol was a fortress of whispers, yet no consensus emerged. The manhunt. President Buchanan, weak and cornered, authorized the creation of a special task force. Troops were dispatched into swamps, forests and mountain hollows. Pinkerton agents were recalled. Bounties were raised to levels never before seen. The term enhanced insurgents appeared in War Department orders. But for every whisper of a capture, there were two of a sighting near the cities, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. Enhanced individuals, it seemed, were no longer hiding. They were studying the very nation that sought to cage them. The marble steps. The crisis reached its zenith on May 15, 1859. Witnesses watched in disbelief as a towering figure strode openly through the streets of Washington. Samson. He moved with calm certainty, as if no law could bind him. He reached the Capitol itself, demanding audience with the committee. The request was denied. How could Congress treat a fugitive slave as an equal? Yet his presence was enough. For hours he lingered, unchallenged, until at last he left behind one final message. Carved into the marble steps by his bare hands were the words, "The experiment is over. The specimens have become the scientists." Then he vanished. The gouges in the Capitol stone remained for years, long after the inquiry was sealed away in classified archives. They were not just vandalism, but testimony, a mark that the enhanced were no longer myths, no longer whispers in quarters or swamps. They had walked brazenly into the heart of power and declared themselves sovereign. Congress had hoped to contain a scandal. Instead, it had uncovered a new people, not slaves, not soldiers, not property, something else entirely. And as the Capitol reeled, as the Pinkertons scrambled, as generals plotted, one truth became unavoidable. The Samson crisis was no longer a question of control but of survival. Washington, 1859. The city buzzed with rumors like flies over a wound. Samson's carving of words into the very marble steps of the Capitol had not only terrified the government, it had humiliated the most powerful nation on earth, flanked by militias draped in flags, guarded by soldiers and marshals, had stood helpless as one fugitive, barefoot and unarmed, strode through its avenues, and left behind a declaration etched in stone. The incident could not be ignored, nor could it be admitted. Thus began a season of whispers, secret midnight carriages, and letters coded in ciphers. No clerk dared to speak aloud. Historians would later call it the Washington Compact, though no treaty was ever signed in public, no record ever officially made. What follows is pieced together from leaked depositions, diaries, and a few rare survivors who risked telling the tale. Panic behind closed doors. Within days of Samson's appearance, the halls of power convulsed. President Buchanan's cabinet met in emergency session. Congressional leaders, both Northern and Southern, locked themselves in smoke-thickened rooms, desperate to conjure a path between war and oblivion. The questions were simple, yet impossible. Could Samson be killed without creating a martyr? Could the enhanced be contained, or had they already multiplied beyond reckoning? What would happen if Britain, France, or Spain learned the United States had created a new class of superhuman and then lost control of them? The military pressed for direct action. General Scott lobbied for the deployment of artillery into suspected hideouts. Pinkerton leaders urged infiltration and assassination, but the politicians had seen Samson's calm defiance and felt something the generals did not fear of exposure. If word spread that the government had secretly engineered abominations, experimenting on the enslaved and the desperate, the nation might implode before the secession crisis ever arrived. The secret approach. It was in this climate that intermediaries appeared, men in plain coats, Quaker hats pulled low, faces unrecorded. They carried a message sealed in wax, bearing no name but written in Samson's unmistakable hand. We are not an army, we are a people. You cannot exterminate us, for we are already among you. You cannot enslave us, for we have learned freedom. If you wish peace, speak to us as equals. If you wish war, then let it be written in the blood of your cities. It was not a demand. It was an invitation. The government accepted. The compartmental meetings. The first meeting took place at midnight in a warehouse by the Potomac. Records suggest 5 congressmen, 2 army officers, and 1 representative of the Treasury attended. They expected Samson alone. Instead, he arrived with 12 companions, men and women enhanced like him, each carrying themselves with the poise of diplomats rather than fugitives. The air was thick with tension. Soldiers gripped muskets, hands slick with sweat. One enhanced man, described later as taller than any 2 men stacked, his skin shining like burnished bronze,
simply stood with folded arms, watching. Samson spoke first. "Your fear betrays you. You think us beasts, but beasts do not carve words in marble, nor do they gather in peace when vengeance would be so much easier." He laid out his terms plainly. Immediate cessation of all enhancement experiments, the release of all who had been altered and still lived in government captivity, the right to disappear into mountains, swamps and far lands without pursuit. In return, he promised restraint, no uprisings, no open war. The enhanced would vanish like mist, so long as the government allowed silence, resistance from the South. Southern representatives balked. To them, Samson was not a negotiator, but a runaway who had murdered his master and corrupted dozens of slaves into rebellion. To grant his demands would be to admit equality, perhaps even superiority. Senator James Henry Hammond thundered, "This Samson would set precedent, that the Negro may dictate terms to Congress itself. Better we burn him alive than give him quarter." But cooler heads prevailed. The Northern Bloc reminded Hammond that burning Samson might ignite something far worse than rebellion exposure. If the public learned that Southern planters had willingly collaborated in such experiments, the institution of slavery might collapse overnight, not from abolitionists, but from disgust. The South relented, not with agreement but with silence. The Second Compact. A month later, another meeting, this one deeper in secrecy, in a cellar beneath the Treasury itself. Here the framework of what would later be called the Compact was set. The government would quietly shutter its enhancement programs, funding lines were rerouted, documents burned, laboratories dismantled brick by brick. Captured subjects would be released, one by one at night in remote places. Some were set loose in the Appalachians, others in Louisiana swamps. The enhanced would agree to disappear. No more public demonstrations, no more marble inscriptions, no more letters. Their existence would become myth, rumor, ghost story. In exchange, Samson and his people pledged no further hostilities. The Washington intrigue. Of course not all agreed. Pinkerton agents were still dispatched on quiet hunts. Southern militias, driven by fear and vengeance, raided suspected hideouts. At least 9 enhanced individuals were killed in those years, but each death came with consequences. Farms burned mysteriously, overseers vanished, militia leaders found hanging in their barns. It became clear that direct violence only brought retaliation swift and untraceable. By 1860, both sides kept to their bargain, not out of trust, but necessity. Samson's disappearance. The last verifiable sighting of Samson came in late autumn of 1860, on the eve of Lincoln's election. A fur trader in Missouri claimed to have guided a party of giants northward, across icy rivers and into the wilderness that would one day become Alaska. He described Samson as older, wearier, yet still commanding, still followed by dozens who carried themselves like kings in exile. Whether they sought isolation, or a land untouched by the American experiment, none can say. But from that day, Samson's trail vanishes into the snow. The sealed files. Back in Washington, the compact was buried. Testimonies were locked in sealed files within the War Department. Marble gouges on the Capitol steps were sanded, polished and erased. The newspapers were hushed. Even Abraham Lincoln, when briefed years later, dismissed it as old ghosts from Buchanan's era. Yet the whispers endure. Soldiers spoke of strange allies in the wilderness during the Civil War, figures who appeared, fought with inhuman strength, and then melted away. Plantation records told of slaves who vanished in chains only to reappear free, their shackles broken like twigs. The enhanced had not died, they had simply gone underground. The Washington Compact was never ratified, never signed, never acknowledged, yet it shaped the nation as surely as any law. It was a pact born of fear, sealed in shadows, and remembered only in whispers. And in those whispers lingers the truth. The government did not defeat Samson, it bargained with him. And when the ink of history dried, it was not Congress that claimed victory. It was the bone breaker of Little Rock, who forced the most powerful men in America to treat him not as property, but as a sovereign power. For in the end, Samson had not just snapped a master's neck, he had bent the republic itself. When Samson vanished from the streets of Washington, many believed he was gone for good. Politicians congratulated themselves, Pinkerton agents claimed quiet victories, and generals assured their superiors that the enhanced threat was contained. Yet in truth, Samson had not been captured, nor killed. He had simply stepped into shadow, and in the shadow, he multiplied into legend, into the wilderness. The last verifiable report came in November 1860, when a fur trader out of Louis swore under oath that he guided a company of giants across the Missouri River. He described Samson leading the group, his frame still towering, his gait as steady as the river current. Among his companions were men and women, black and white alike, each marked by the quiet gravity of those who had endured something otherworldly. They carried no wagons, no herds, no baggage, only tools, rifles, and a strange discipline. They walked like soldiers, but not under command, the trader said, like wolves in a pack, each free, each fierce, but bound together. From there the trail turned cold. Rumors placed Samson in the Appalachians, then Canada, then as far as Alaska's frozen ridges. Whether all these sightings were real or mere whispers feeding the legend, no one can say. The bloodline theory. As years passed, whispers changed shape. Some claimed Samson had not disappeared, but seeded a bloodline. In black communities of the North, tales spread of children born with impossible strength, boys who could wrestle grown men before they turned 10, girls who snapped iron locks in their hands as though they were reed. One story told of a youth in Philadelphia, who in 1865, lifted a fallen carriage from atop his trapped sister. Another of a young woman in Boston, who survived a factory collapse with not a bone broken, though the beams crushed everyone else around her. Were these children Samsons? Some swore yes. Others said the enhancement experiments had altered not just the man but the seed, passing down traits the way eye color and height were inherited. If true, Samson had not vanished at all. He had planted a future. The Northern networks. By 1863, as the Civil War raged, Union officers began reporting strange encounters. Scouts in Tennessee described meeting shadow allies, tall men who emerged from forests, guided regiments through swamps and vanished before dawn. Confederate survivors told of impossible feats, supply wagons overturned by unseen hands, bridges collapsing, as if pulled apart, sentries strangled by something that moved too fast to see. In every story the same detail recurred: eyes that glowed faint in the dark, and strength beyond reason. Union command dismissed these reports as superstition, but some abolitionist circles whispered that Samson and his people had sided, unofficially, with the Union cause, striking silently, not for Lincoln, but for the freedom of the enslaved. Pinkerton pursuits. The government never truly let go of Samson. The Pinkertons, private detectives turned federal hounds, were tasked with tracking him in secret. Reports unearthed in the 20th century reveal at least 7 major manhunts between one, in the Adirondacks, ended with 3 agents found frozen, their bodies broken as though crushed by massive hands. Another, in the marshes of Maryland, resulted in the disappearance of an entire 12-man team, their camp discovered abandoned, the ground scarred by deep gouges, as though by claws. No body, no capture, no proof. Each hunt ended the same way, silent.
The folk hero. Among the enslaved and the newly freed, Samson transformed into something larger than human. He was sung about in work songs, his name buried in verses to avoid suspicion. Field hands whispered that Samson walked among them in disguise, hiding in plain sight, working as a freedman by day and shattering chains by night. Some said he was immortal, cursed to wander until every man was free. Others said he lived beneath the earth, in caverns with his kin, waiting for the day America's sins boiled over. Mothers frightened disobedient children with his shadow, while fathers encouraged their sons with tales of his defiance. To the oppressed he was salvation, to the powerful he was nightmare incarnate. Echoes of fear. The Washington Compact had silenced Samson's name in official records, but fear seeped through the cracks. Plantation owners in Louisiana began reinforcing their mansions with iron bars, whispering that the bone breaker might return. Southern newspapers mocked the idea, yet late at night in private their editors locked their doors twice over. The mere rumor of Samson was enough to command respect, a ghost with more power than an army. An incident in Canada. The most compelling account of Samson after 1860 comes from Ontario. In 1867, a lumber camp near Thunder Bay reported a violent encounter. Workers spoke of a giant black man who tore through the camp after an overseer beat a Metis boy. The overseer's body was later found with his neck broken, the exact manner in which Samson had killed his master years earlier. Witnesses swore the man matched Samson's description perfectly: impossibly tall, shoulders broad enough to blot out the sun, his voice calm yet resonant, like a bell. But after that night he was never seen again. The Canadian authorities dismissed it as brawling among workers, but the locals whispered otherwise. Samson had passed through. The legacy of silence. By 1870, Samson's presence had become less a fact and more a shadow on the wall of history. Official America wanted him forgotten. Unofficial America kept him alive in memory, song and blood. Some claimed that certain Civil War veterans carried stories too terrifying to print, tales of men in blue uniforms watching Samson stride across battlefield, scattering enemies like straw. Others swore they saw him in Reconstruction, a quiet figure advising freedmen's councils before vanishing into the night. Nothing could be proven. Everything could be believed. The question of blood. By the turn of the century, scientists and journalists began circling the legend. Were Samson's descendants alive? Could his traits be measured, extracted, weaponized again? The government, despite its compact, had not forgotten. In the 1920s, during the eugenics craze, certain files were reopened. Men in white coats searched for families with unusual strength, tracing genealogies back to plantations in Arkansas and Mississippi. But the trail always bent towards silence. Families changed names, burned records, vanished between censuses. Some lines were hidden deliberately, perhaps by the enhanced themselves, determined never to let the cycle of bondage and experimentation return. Samson's story after Washington is one of absence filled by myth. He may have died in the snow. He may have fathered children whose descendants walk among us still. He may have lived in secret until old age, his bones resting in some unmarked grave known only to those who loved him. What cannot be denied is this: Samson did not lose, he did not bow. He stepped into the wilderness and became larger than any chain, any master, any government could contain. And in that wilderness he left behind echoes, whispers of strength, visions of defiance, and the haunting possibility that his blood still flows through veins today. Samson was not simply the bone breaker of Little Rock. He was the seed of a hidden nation. The war had ended, but peace did not follow. The surrender at Appomattox closed one conflict and opened another. Freed people found themselves declared citizens by proclamation, yet hunted, terrorized and starved in practice. White militias, styling themselves as night riders, rode to enforce the old order under new disguise. Amidst this chaos, one question burned quietly in Washington: where was Samson? The answer mattered less than the symbol. For the government, the symbol had to be erased. For the freedmen, the symbol had to endure. For physicians and theorists, some cloaked in respectability, others in outright fanaticism, the symbol had to be dissected. Bureau files. Among the surviving fragments of the Freedmen's Bureau records is a memorandum marked confidential, not for public circulation. Dated 1868, it reads, "Certain rumors persist regarding the former slave Samson, surname never ascertained. It is alleged that he survived the disturbances of 57 and 59 and now resides in various guises among the colored population of the Upper South. Reports describe unnatural strength among his supposed kin, raising the question of transmissible enhancement. Recommend discreet inquiry through Bureau medical officers before such rumors embolden insurrectionary spirits. No name sign, only a wax seal partly melted, stamped with the War Department crest." The first case, that same year, in Nashville, a Bureau physician recorded treating a young man for injuries after a riot. The doctor noted that the patient, listed only as ruttled, displayed bone density unlike any common specimen, and that fractures healed in a manner unnaturally swift. 2 days later the patient was gone. No discharge papers, no burial record, only the entry in the ledger remains, written in hurried hand, with a final line heavily struck out. Families watched. It was not only Samson the Bureau pursued, but his supposed progeny. Families once enslaved at the Ruttled plantation found themselves under peculiar scrutiny. Midwives whispered of Bureau agents attending births, measuring infants' heads with calipers, pricking skin to collect vials of blood. In one parish register from Little Rock, the minister penciled in the margin, "Some children born with Samson's mark. The agents came and took them." The entry is faint, almost rubbed away, as though someone tried to erase it. The rise of eugenics. By the 1870s, science in America had turned to a dangerous new fashion. Eugenics, learned in men in Harvard halls and New York societies, spoke of hereditary vigor and degeneration. Samson's story, though buried in official archives, leaked in whispers among them, proof, perhaps, that the human frame could be altered. bred, refined. In 1874, Dr. Horace Winship of Boston delivered a paper before the American Medical Association. It survives only in fragments, most pages redacted in later reprintings. We have before us evidence of a lineage, accidental perhaps, yet demonstrative of the principle that superior endowment, physical, mental, even moral, may be transmitted. The specimen called Samson, a Negro slave of Arkansas origin, presents in his posterity attributes beyond ordinary scale. The paper was suppressed after protest, yet copies circulated privately, marked not for general distribution. Samson in exile. While physicians sought his blood, common folk continued to seek his presence. Freedmen migrating north carried tales of Samson as guide, protector, avenger. An account from Cincinnati describes a stranger arriving at a church meeting in 1871. A tall black man with eyes like burnished iron, who warned the congregation to keep watch, for men would come with chains disguised as contracts. He left before dawn, never to be seen again. Was it Samson himself, or one of those molded in his image? To those present, the difference mattered little. A government in panic. Congressional testimony from 1876 reveals how deeply Samson haunted official memory. In a closed session on instability in the South, one representative from Mississippi declared, "If Samson yet lives, he is the germ of sedition. If he breeds, he is the ruin of order." This Congress cannot allow either possibility. The hearing was struck from the public record. Only in scattered stenographers' notes, saved in personal trunks and rediscovered decades later, do the words survive. The disappearing children. The most chilling aspect of this period lies in the stories of children. Throughout Reconstruction, reports circulated of black infants and toddlers vanishing from rural communities. Officials dismissed them as kidnappings by night riders or desperate adoptions by northern missionaries. Yet survivors whispered another explanation. Government men in plain clothes, offering coin to midwives, or threatening them into silence. The suspicion lingered. They were taking Samson's bloodline, piece by piece. One freed woman, Sarah, left a deposition in 1880. They came in daylight, 3 of them, with a paper saying they was doctors for the Bureau. They took my boy, said it was for treatment. He never come back. They wrote his name wrong in the book, like it weren't never. But I seen the mark in his hands. Samson's strength was in him. They knew it. That's why they took him. Her statement was filed under unverified. Kleinman in silence. And what of Dr. Marcus Kleinman, whose testimony had first cracked the enhancement program open? After 1859 he was placed under restricted service in remote facilities, far from public eyes, yet correspondence uncovered in the 1920s shows that his expertise was still quietly sought. A letter to the Army Medical Museum, dated 1872, requests consultation on inherited anomalies, traceable to Arkansas subjects per your earlier findings. The signature is illegible, the ink blurred by water damage. Kleinman's reply has never been found. Samson as myth, Samson as threat. By the end of Reconstruction, 2 Samsons walked America. One was the folk hero, breaker of chains, phantom avenger, eternal wanderer. He stood in sermons, in lullabies, in whispered prayers before the lash. The other was the state's nightmare, a genetic contagion, a breeding stock of rebellion, an enhanced nation within a nation. In Washington offices and medical halls, he existed not as man but as specimen, a cipher in ledgers, a shadow on X-ray plates, a bloodline to be tracked and, if possible, extinguished. The war was over, Reconstruction was collapsing, but the story of Samson had not ended. It had shifted from open uprising to hidden war, a struggle fought in birthrooms, in courthouses, in laboratories, in the back rooms of government halls. The plantation master had died in 8, yet the system he embodied adapted. It learned to wear white coats, to carry calipers instead of whips, to write laws instead of chains. Samson had broken a neck. His children, real or imagined, threatened to break an empire of silence. The dust of Reconstruction had hardly settled when a new language of control began to rise. Where chains and overseers had once held dominion, now statistics and scalpels claimed authority. Learned men, cloaked in the solemnity of science, spoke of degeneracy, fitness, and the dangerous inheritance of the in their polished halls and journals, one story lingered in whispers, seldom printed but always remembered: the slave Samson,
who had snapped his master's neck in Little Rock and walked out of bondage with a strength no man should hold. It was said his bloodline lived on. To the eugenicists, that possibility was irresistible. The cold hallways of science. In 1883, Francis Galton in London coined the word eugenics, the science of good breeding. Across the Atlantic, American physicians seized the idea with fever. They compiled family charts, measured skulls, recorded lineages of imbeciles and criminals, and in certain secret conferences, they spoke of a different family altogether, not degenerates, but the enhanced. A letter from Dr. Horace Winship to his colleague, Alonzo Chittenden in 1885 hints at this obsession. You and I know well that the Negro specimen, Samson, represents more than folklore. There are those of his strain still among us, passing as ordinary freedmen. Their vigor is transmissible. The danger is clear. Uncontrolled propagation will alter our nation's stock. I propose a confidential study, properly funded, that may determine the extent of his posterity. The letter was marked private destroy after reading. Somehow it survived. Specimens. Hospital records from Tennessee and Arkansas in the 1880s reveal curious anomalies. Patients admitted for routine ailments, fever, broken limbs, childbirth, were often listed with cryptic notations. Specimen A, marked bone density, blood viscosity abnormal. These patients, disproportionately drawn from black communities, connected to the old Ruttled estate, vanished from the ledgers after a single visit. No follow-up, no burial, no explanation. In the margins of one register, a nurse wrote in faint pencil, "They take the strong ones away." They call it study, but it is theft. Kleinman's shadow, Dr. Marcus Kleinman, the reluctant whistleblower of the 1850s, was still alive in this period, an old man working quietly under restricted service. Officially he was compiling anatomical texts for the Army Medical Museum. Unofficially, correspondence suggests, he was consulted on hereditary anomalies. A redacted transcript from 1889 notes, Dr. K. confirms heritability of certain traits in Arkansas subjects, recommends continued collection of offspring samples for long-term study, states, enhanced strength may diminish after 2 generations, but remains detectable in bone structure. Kleinman died in 8. His private papers were seized by the War Department. To this day, none have been released. Folk memory. While physicians hunted specimens, the black communities of Arkansas and Tennessee kept a different memory alive. They told stories of children who lifted wagon wheels before their voices had broken, of daughters whose arms could split oak kindling without axe or wedge, of sons who ran faster than horses, but were taught to slow down, lest someone notice. Grandmothers whispered warnings, "Hide your strength, the doctors come for the strong." One sermon, preserved in a Freedman's Church minute book, reads, "The Lord gave Samson of old his might and they sought to bind him. The Lord gave our Samson his power, and men in coats seek to bind him still. Do not boast of what is in your blood. The world would rather cut it out than honor it." The criminalization of strength. By the 1890s, Southern sheriffs began circulating pamphlets on Negro crime. One entry described mulatto brutes of extraordinary stature, suspected of criminal heredity. Though couched in racist language, the description matches what bureau agents once noted: unusual strength, unusual defiance. Court records from Little Rock 1894 describe a young black man sentenced to death for defiance of arrest. Witnesses swore he had torn iron bars from a jail window before being subdued by a dozen deputies. His name was recorded as John Doe. No kin claimed the body. Rumors of the North. Meanwhile, northern newspapers occasionally printed oddities. Extraordinary athlete from Arkansas impresses audiences at traveling exhibition. Chicago Tribune. Colored laborer lifts wagon alone. Crowd gathers in astonishment. Boston Evening Transcript, 1895. The stories were dismissed as carnival exaggeration, yet in backrooms, physicians clipped these reports, underlining names, and sending them to government office.
The myth of a colony. Among the Alaskan natives, another legend was told. It spoke of tall strangers who arrived after the war, carrying tools and knowledge. They built settlements in the remote woods, strong and secretive. Some said they never aged as others did. Missionary diaries from the 1880s mention these southern men who spoke little but displayed uncanny skills in medicine and carpentry. Whether these were truly Samson's people or not, the stories fed the myth that the enhanced had carved out a place where no sheriff or doctor could reach them. Ethics in eclipse. The late 19th century was a time of surgical ambition, antiseptics, anesthesia, the promise of progress, yet under its white light shadows thrived. Experiments on prisoners, orphans, and the poor multiplied, cloaked in respectability. Within this environment, the hunt for Samson's bloodline was easy to disguise. A study labeled Comparative Physiology of Negro Laborers could conceal forced examinations. A grant for hereditary bone disorders could justify drawing blood from unwilling subjects. The enhanced, once slaves, were now specimens in a new economy, the economy of medical progress. As the century turned, America congratulated itself on industry and invention. Railroads spanned the continent, telephones connected cities, electric lamps turned night to day. Yet beneath this brilliance, the story of Samson persisted, not as a tale of freedom, but as a secret ledger of bodies, tests, and vanished names. Science had inherited the whip, and in polished lecture halls men with pens in their hands carried on the work that once required iron chains. The question lingered like a bruise. Was Samson dead, or had his blood already remade the nation in ways no archive would ever confess? History, it is said, bends toward disclosure. Secrets grow brittle. Records once hidden acquire cracks, and through those fissures light begins to leak. By the dawn of the 20th century, the tale of Samson was no longer confined to plantation rumor or backroom medical conferences. It began to surface in hearings, pamphlets, and pulpits, and with its surfacing came the question that haunted every participant: who truly controlled the story and who would pay the price for its telling? A congressional murmur. In 1902, Representative Amos Giddings of Massachusetts reopened the question of hereditary anomalies among the colored population. He had served on earlier committees in the 1860s, where Kleinman's testimony was quietly buried. Now, in an aging but defiant voice, he hinted at suppressed files. From the Congressional Record, May 4, 1902, the Department of War holds documents, I have glimpsed them myself, detailing a strain of abnormal strength, traced and measured. Are we to remain silent while science conducts its work upon living men without consent? The chamber erupted. Southern representatives roared accusations of fabrication. Northern moderates begged Giddings to desist. The matter was tabled in hours, but the spark had escaped, and newspapers seized upon it. Public unease. Papers from Boston to Louis reprinted fragments of the Samson story, stripped of detail but lurid in tone. The bone breaker of Little Rock, was he the first of a new race? New York Herald, May 9. Strange inquiries into Negro strength. Congress hears alarming claims. Chicago Daily News, June. Editorials mocked the notion, yet their mockery betrayed unease. Ordinary readers began asking, if such men existed, where were they now? The hand of the Bureau behind the scenes, the Bureau of Investigation, a precursor to the FBI, moved swift. Memoranda from 1903 reveal urgent directives. Secure all references to subject Samson in public discourse. Suppress unauthorized testimonies. Monitor medical faculties in Tennessee, Arkansas, and Washington for leak. Report individuals exhibiting unusual strength for labor contract evaluation. These instructions bear the stamp Bureau Memorandum 14, restricted circulation. It was no longer plantation owners or Pinkerton detectives who managed the myth. It was now the federal state itself. The Arkansas testimonies. At the same time, voices from the black community of Arkansas refused silence. In Pine Bluff, a pastor named Reverend Elijah Grayson preached a sermon titled, "The Strong Shall Not Be Hidden." He declared, "They name him Samson, as in the Bible, and as in the Bible men would bind him with cords, with fetters, with words like specimen and anomaly, but the Lord's truth cannot be shackled. If his children walk among us, they are proof that freedom runs deeper than chain." Transcripts of his sermons circulated, copied by hand and mailed through church networks. They reached Chicago, Philadelphia, even Harlem. By 1905, black newspapers openly claimed that Samson's blood lives on. The confrontation in Memphis. The breaking point came in Memphis. A laborer named Daniel Gant was arrested after an altercation at the docks. Witnesses testified he had lifted a cargo crate, no 6 men together could move, and hurled it into the river in a fit of rage. Gant was charged with assault and disturbing the peace, yet when he stood trial, journalists recognized the description. Another Samson. The Memphis Commercial Appeal ran the headline, "A modern Samson on the docks, inheritor of the Bonebreaker's might." The courtroom overflowed. Medical men, bureau officials, and ordinary citizens crowded in. Gant's defense attorney, a fiery black lawyer named Nathaniel Walker, declared, "My client is no freak, no specimen. He is a man. His strength condemns him only because you fear what he represents. A freedom you cannot chain." The jury convicted Gant nonetheless, but the trial had torn secrecy open. Kleinman's name revived. In the trial's wake, suppressed testimony from Dr. Marcus Kleinman resurfaced. Photostats of his 1858 letters, describing the Ruttled plantation, the dissection tools, the fear of hereditary strength, were leaked to sympathetic reporters. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch published excerpts under the title, "The Doctor Who Knew Samson." One passage drew particular horror. "I advise restraint, if not termination of such subjects, for their breeding would alter the balance of the Republic." Public outrage flared. What had once been an obscure medical footnote became evidence of state-sanctioned violation. Panic in Washington. By late 1906, officials faced 2 fronts, the fear of exposure and the fear of uprising. If communities believed Samson's children lived, could that belief inspire rebellion? The Bureau responded with a dual strategy, denounced the story as myth in public, while deepening its surveillance in private. Circulars declared, "No credible evidence supports the existence of hereditary anomalies," yet confidential funds were allocated to special study programs at Johns Hopkins and Harvard, disguised as research into bone disease. The legacy of fear. Families connected to the old Ruttled estate grew cautious. Oral histories recall fathers warning their sons, "Do not lift too much, do not fight too hard. They will call you Samson, and then you will vanish." Some fled north, blending into factory crowds. Others headed west, toward Oklahoma, or even Alaska, chasing the myth of safety in distance. Yet the legend proved uncontainable. For every suppression, a new rumor arose. In Chicago taverns, men whispered of a boxer who never lost. In Kansas wheat fields, tales spread of a boy who could carry a plow alone. Samson had become more than a man. He was now a cipher, an accusation, a prophecy. By the first decade of the new century, the confrontation was unmistakable. Secrecy against exposure, science against folk memory, the state against the community it sought to dissect. The name Samson, once confined to a single act of violence on Thanksgiving Day, had multiplied into 100 disputes, each threatening to tear the fabric of silence apart. The reckoning had begun, and with it the promise of something far darker. For when a state grows desperate to control a story, the measures it employs are rarely humane. There are moments in history when silence becomes untenable. For nearly half a century the name of Samson had been pressed down, buried beneath congressional redactions, sealed medical reports, and whispered plantation stories. But as the 20th century dawned and evidence leaked into the public sphere, those who had once sworn secrecy now scrambled to craft a settlement. It was not compassion that drove them. It was fear. Fear of exposure, fear of rebellion, fear of what Samson's name and the bloodline attached to it might inspire. The summer of 1859, revisited, the confrontation that would come to be known in hushed corridors as the Washington Compact began in June. Though the nation's attention was already tightening toward the fissures that would erupt into civil war, behind closed doors another war threatened to burst forth, not one of North against South, but of secrecy against revelation. President James Buchanan, reluctant and weary, recognized the risk. If the federal government attempted to quash the enhanced subject crisis by force, the bloodshed would be catastrophic, and worse, public. So he authorized his Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, to negotiate directly, not openly, not through Congress, but through a lattice of intermediaries, abolitionist leaders who had sheltered Samson's followers, physicians who had treated them in shadow, and federal officials who recognized that brute suppression was already impossible. Samson's terms,
Samson did not demand vengeance. His demands, carried through coded letters and oral testimony, were measured, yet radical for their time: the cessation of all human enhancement experiments conducted under federal auspices, the destruction of all records, ledgers and surgical instruments connected to those programs, the provision of new identities and financial stipends for subjects who wished to live quietly, integrated among the public, and most shocking, the establishment of a separate territory in the remote reaches of Alaska, then still under Russian dominion, where those unwilling to assimilate might dwell apart, self-governing and unmolested. This final demand required extraordinary diplomacy. Russian officials, eager to cultivate American goodwill ahead of a likely territorial sale, quietly cooperated. To the public, Alaska remained a wilderness of ice and silence. To those in the know, it became the designated refuge of the Samsonites. Dr. Kleinman's role. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, whose name had been tethered to every stage of the scandal, reappeared at this juncture, facing potential charges of unlawful experimentation. He bargained for immunity. In return, he surrendered every chart, sketch and anatomical measurement he possessed. These records, grotesque in detail, enabled government doctors to design treatments by which certain enhanced subjects could be dampened, their musculature subdued with tinctures, their reflexes blunted by a regimen of bleeding and ether. Those who accepted such treatments could be eased into ordinary life under forged names, dispersed across northern states. Kleinman thus became both betrayer and savior, betrayer of his former patients, savior of his own skin. He was quietly relocated, his research stripped from him, allowed to live out his days under guard, still writing in Latin and cipher. Samson's last message. In August of 1859, Samson issued what would be his final known communication with federal authority, delivered through a Quaker intermediary. It reads in part, "I have no wish to dwell among those who regard men like me as property or weapons, yet I desire no more suffering, not among my people nor among yours." This compact offers a path forward, one that spares life, even if it condemns memory. May those who come after us learn to measure strength, not by the body, but by the dignity with which one endures. It is a voice at once weary and resolute, not a call to arms, but a plea for coexistence. Implementation of the compact. In the months that followed, enhanced subjects were given choices. Through the hidden channels of the Underground Railroad, messengers carried word. Those who chose integration received new papers, funds and treatment to reduce their capability. They were settled in distant towns where no one would recognize their gait, their eyes, their grip. Many became farmers, craftsmen or small shopkeepers. Their talents aided them, but always in ways concealed. A smith who struck iron too swiftly was reminded to slow his hammer. Those who chose separation were ferried north in stages, hidden in train cars and supply wagons, to ports on the Great Lakes, then shipped through covert passage to the Alaskan frontier. Samson himself chose separation. He walked into the northern silence, vanishing into a landscape where no journalist, no doctor, no archivist could follow. Secrecy and its price. The Washington Compact was never acknowledged in public record. Instead, congressional inquiries concluded vaguely, citing irregularities in certain research programs but naming no names. Buchanan's administration buried the matter, and when war erupted 2 years later, the compact slipped from national consciousness. Yet secrecy has a way of corroding. Those who knew could never wholly forget. In federal memoranda, the compact was referred to only as the arrangement. Medical faculties received anonymous circulars, warning against experimentation, without informed assent, and the Bureau began to monitor black communities more closely, under the pretext of labor stability. The Alaskan settlements. What became of those who chose exile? Here history grows spectral. Indigenous oral tradition in Alaska speaks of the strong neighbors, men and women who lived apart, yet offered help in times of famine, who lifted logs bare-handed, who vanished into mountain passes, leaving no trail. Missionary accounts describe villages with unusual fortifications, built of timber, arranged in ways unfamiliar to local design. Legends persist of an enclave where tools were fashioned with near-modern precision, decades before such techniques reached the region by conventional means. These fragments hint that Samson's people endured, not merely as fugitives, but as builders of a hidden commonwealth. Ethical reverberations. The compact contained one further clause, little noted at the time, the drafting of principles forbidding experimentation upon human beings without their consent. Though kept under classification, these principles seeded the earliest framework of what modern medicine would later call informed consent. Thus, from a scandal buried in shame, the first articulation of medical ethics in America quietly emerged
toward legend. By the early years of the Civil War, Samson's story was already receding from official notice. Casualties mounted, the Republic fractured. Compared to the fields of Shiloh or Antioch, the tale of a single man's strength seemed insignificant. Yet memory lingered in shadows. Among abolitionists, Samson was invoked as proof of dignity stronger than chains. Among black families in Arkansas, whispered stories reminded children he snapped the master's neck and walked away free. Among Alaskan peoples, the strong neighbors became woven into the fabric of oral tradition. And in government archives, stamped with red ink, the papers of the Washington Compact rested in silence, awaiting rediscovery more than a century later. The Washington Compact did not resolve the horror, it merely postponed its exposure. What had begun with a broken neck in Little Rock now extended into treaties, relocations, and whispered ethical codes. The nation's most powerful men had bargained with an enslaved rebel and lost. Yet the price of that bargain was silence, and silence, as history has shown, is never permanent. The vanishing of Samson. By September of 1859, Samson had crossed into obscurity by design. No newspaper carried his name. No public proclamation acknowledged him. He and those who followed him into exile in Alaska became what they had always been to the nation, an inconvenient truth, better buried. But silence does not erase reality, it only reshapes it. The last confirmed sighting of Samson came from a missionary diary, dated October. The writer described seeing a figure like a tree trunk, shoulders broad as a cabin wall, moving with men who seemed carved of the same stock. The missionary, unnerved, confessed he feared to approach. Beyond that, Samson dissolved into the snowdrifts of history, his trail concealed by mountains and secrecy. Some believe he died within a few years, worn down by the brutal winters. Others claim his descendants lived on for generations, hidden among the strong neighbors of Alaskan legend. In truth, no body was ever found, no grave ever marked. Samson became less a man than a symbol, and perhaps that was how he intended it. The aftermath in Washington. In the capital, the machinery of secrecy ground forward. The Washington Compact was filed under a code word, Arrangement 47, and locked away. Congressional records from the hearings were expunged, testimonies scrubbed, Kleinman's notes sealed. President Buchanan issued quiet orders. The matter was not to be mentioned again. Any official who spoke publicly risked ruin. A handful of doctors and officers were reassigned to remote posts, their silence purchased with stipends or coerced by threats. But the silence was imperfect. Rumors trickled into abolitionist circles. Fragments of Samson's demands circulated in coded pamphlets. Whispers of a slave stronger than 10 men, who defied the master's lash, spread across safe houses on the Underground Railroad. The federal government had tried to bury the truth. Instead, it had planted a seed. The fate of the Kleinman family. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, spared prosecution through cooperation, lived out his days under quiet surveillance. He never again experimented on human subjects, though he continued his obsessive writings on augmentation in coded journals. His family fractured. One son fled westward, seeking to disown the name. Another remained close, carrying his father's notes into private hands after Kleinman's death. For decades, those papers remained hidden. When they resurfaced in the early 20th century, they were dismissed as pseudoscience, but modern eyes have found in them chilling foresight, sketches of surgical methods, crude hormonal theories, and unsettling references to bloodline perpetuation. Enhanced subjects in disguise. For those who chose integration, life was a delicate balance. Some succeeded in vanishing entirely. In census records of the 1860s and 1870s, scattered across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, appear farmers and blacksmiths, whose productivity was unusually high. A tailor in Philadelphia was remembered for lifting bolts of cloth that 2 men struggled to carry. A black woman in Boston ran a boarding house, where guests whispered that her gaze alone quelled drunken brawls. They lived cautiously, careful never to draw too much notice. Many married, had children, and passed their secrets quietly down family lines. Traces of their endurance may yet linger in blood, though no one dares to test. A smaller few could not adapt. There are records of men arrested for violent outbursts, of women institutionalized when their unnatural stamina, unsettled neighbors. These cases were suppressed, tucked away in asylum ledgers, written off as aberrations. The Alaskan settlements, meanwhile in the Alaskan wilderness, the separated communities thrived in obscurity. Oral accounts from indigenous groups describe villages of towering men and women, who built cabins with beams no ox team could have raised, who hunted without firearms, who kept strict laws among themselves. The strong neighbors, as they came to be known, were feared and respected. They traded rarely, but when famine struck, they shared food. They asked for nothing in return but silence. By the time Alaska was formally sold to the United States in 1867, these communities had already melted deeper into the interior. American surveyors reported finding abandoned structures, far sturdier than native design, and paths cut through stone as if carved by chisels of iron. But by then the Samsonites had vanished again, choosing survival over discovery. The Civil War overshadows all. In April of 1861, war erupted. With it, the story of Samson evaporated from public attention. The Union tore itself apart, and in the flood of death that followed, who cared for whispers of one man's rebellion? The massacre at Antietam, the starvation at Andersonville, the march of Sherman, these swallowed Samson's tale whole. And yet, traces remain. Among Union soldiers who had once moved through the Underground Railroad, rumors circulated of a hidden army in the North, waiting for the time to rise. Confederate officers heard similar tales and warned of giant Negroes bred for war. Neither side ever produced evidence, but the fear lingered, and fear is often more powerful than proof. Samson as legend. By the late 19th century, Samson's story lived mostly in whispers. For black families in Arkansas and beyond, he became a folk hero, a symbol of resistance. Children were told, Samson broke the master's neck and walked away free. In these tellings, he was larger than life, sometimes said to have crushed chains in his bare hands, sometimes said to have wrestled bare. Among white communities, the story warped into a cautionary tale of what happens when slaves are given too much strength. Planters in the Deep South told one another that experiments had once gone too far, producing monsters. This fueled paranoia and further cruelty, even as the truth remained locked in archives. Rediscovery in the 20th century. It was not until the mid-20th century that fragments of the Washington Compact resurfaced. Declassified memoranda hinted at special arrangements made in Kleinman's coded journals were discovered in a private estate sale, and in Alaska, anthropologists recorded oral histories from elders describing outsiders, strong as trees, who vanished into the mountains. Historians debated whether these were myths, exaggerations, or distorted memories, but the convergence of sources made dismissal difficult. By the 1970s, Samson's story was whispered again, not as legend alone, but as suppressed history. The handprints, perhaps the most enduring artifact, lay in Arkansas. The Ruttled Plantation carriage house, abandoned after the Civil War, stood in ruin for decades. In its oak beams, visitors saw impressions like the press of enormous hands. Samson's handprints, left the night he broke free. Locals swore the wood never splintered nor rotted where those marks lay, as if the pressure had hardened it. Children dared one another to place their hands within the prints, only to feel the overwhelming size, far greater than any mortal. By the early 20th century, scavengers stripped the ruins for timber, but the handprints were remembered. Some fragments of the beams survive in private collections, though their provenance is disputed. What remains unknown? What became of Samson? Did he die in the snows of Alaska? Did he live to old age, passing wisdom to a hidden generation? Or did he simply vanish into the silence he had chosen, content that his struggle had carved a mark deeper than marble or oak? The truth is buried, in sealed archives, in vanished villages, in unmarked graves. But what endures is the challenge he posed, not just to his masters, but to the nation itself. Samson forced America to face its own hypocrisy, a country founded on liberty, experimenting on men it called property. The story of Samson is not only about strength, it is about the danger of secrecy, the corruption of science without ethics, and the resilience of the human spirit. His legacy threads through abolitionist struggle, through early medical ethics, through the whispered warnings of Alaskan elders. He remains a shadow,
half legend, half history, but perhaps that is fitting, for Samson was never meant to be a subject in a ledger. He was meant to be free, and in freedom, even obscurity can be a kind of victory. The bone breaker of Little Rock snapped more than a master's neck on that Thanksgiving night in 8. He snapped the illusion that bondage could contain the will to resist. He snapped the silence that cloaked cruelty in civility. He snapped the chains of his era, and though the nation tried to bury him, his story presses still against the archive walls, waiting, like his handprints in oak, for those brave enough to see.